One of the consequences of grief when it impacts upon a school is that it generates enormous anxiety in parents, children and also teachers and school leaders. And so one of the important things to consider is how to actually manage and contain that anxiety. We can do that with good preparation, good planning. We can also do it with the way that we actually carry out the work when those experiences take place. So the idea of providing a sense of safety and order and predictability. One of the other consequences of events in schools is that people are hardwired to make meaning of their experience, to make sense of it. And so frequently it's very important to quickly establish what we call a dominant narrative about what took place, so that people, again, can feel reassured. In working with schools, arriving to school after the death of a child, for example, you notice that the hugs and the goodbyes from parents to their children are longer, the hugs are tighter than they were the day before. And so I think when we start to think about grief, we need to consider really our own personal response to loss. How does this experience impact upon us? To what extent are we available to other people in order to provide support? So I think first of all it's important for people to be self-aware. How does this experience affect us? Often we also focus very early on how can we support others. I think it's important for teachers and school leaders to acknowledge that they are also part of that grieving community. So how do they acknowledge their own sense of loss? How do they also take care of themselves? I think there's also a sense that experiences of loss, grief and anxiety raise big questions for people, big questions of meaning. Why did this happen? Why did it happen now? And often the answers to those questions lie in conversation, in developing a shared meaning. And so providing staff with an opportunity to share their own response, to talk about their own experience. In working in schools, I think for me, what determines most clearly in terms of how the school will manage is the school leader. The extent to which they model grief behaviours, the extent to which they give permission for staff to acknowledge not just the practical implications of this experience, but also how do we actually acknowledge and give permission for staff to acknowledge their own grief. I mean, every organisation has rules. I mean, they also have feeling rules. They have rules about to what extent can we talk about this, or to what extent do we actually move into a very kind of cognitive problem-solving approach. Often these feeling rules don't acknowledge the enormous diversity and the idiosyncratic quality of grief, that people respond to grief in a myriad of ways. People can respond to grief publicly, through conversation, through expressing their distress or concern, through their behaviour. But we also have people who express their grief much more privately. It's more important for them to get their head around the experience than their heart. And the research would indicate that both those responses or styles of grieving are equally acceptable and equally useful. So I think one of the great challenges for school leaders is to address the question, how do I accommodate the diversity in grieving responses? And how do I create a safe space for all staff? That might be through information, but it might be through private conversations. It might also be through ritual that exists for staff. I think it's also important to know your staff in terms of their own personal history of loss. I recently went to a school after a suicide in a secondary school setting, and was made available to talk to staff in the wake of that experience. All those conversations, without exception, were not about the suicide, but about how this experience had impacted upon their own particular experience of loss. And when we think of loss, we're not just thinking here in terms of death. Grief is our response to change, and that change may be a favourable one, such as a school reorganisation, or a promotion which changes us. I mean, we get more money, we get more responsibility, potentially more job satisfaction, but there's also a shadow of loss to that as well. It changes our relationships with peers. It often puts more pressure and stress on family relationships, or even our ability to care for ourselves. So when we think about knowing somebody's loss history, it's important for us to have a sense of how that experience might resonate with this particular experience of loss that they're facing at that point in time. Another very common theme is the idea that grief and loss is being seen as a threat, as an insult to the school, to the organisation. And I think we really need to reconceptualise these experiences of grief. That in a sense, these are also teachable moments. We can't not communicate to our staff and to our teachers and to parents and to children about these experiences. And even when we're not communicating, when we take the view that least said, soonest mended, we provide a very strong message about the nature of grief, that there is something unspeakable, unmentionable about this experience of loss, rather than seeing the experience of grief as part of the broader tapestry of life. And so I think what we need to do is to be much more proactive, to engage in outreach to others, to also focus from a perspective of resiliency, that the overwhelming majority of people manage experiences of even quite complex grief with enormous resilience and capacity. And so to take a truly non-pathological view of grief, that with the support of friends, families and peers, that most people manage this experience of loss well. In fact, we know the thing that predicts good outcome best is social support. Being surrounded by people that love and care for us seems to be the thing that predicts outcome, a favourable outcome. The response of many schools often is to seek lots of additional input from other services and agencies. And I think there's also been a change in the research which suggests that schools, in a sense, are in the best position to manage their own experiences. Certainly with outside agencies providing support or consultancy or assistance, but really these experiences are best supported within the context of relationships that already have existed, and to support staff in their own ability to have difficult conversations with students about change. One of the real issues in terms of events now is managing the well-meaning but sometimes misdirected good intentions of outside services. Often services where we actually don't have well-developed pre-existing relationships. And the danger is that a lot of those external inputs can undermine those networks of support and care that exist. When we think about grief, we often think of grief in reactive terms, that if somebody experiences loss, then they need counselling. Again, the research wouldn't support that. In fact, that a very small proportion of people would A, need counselling, and B, would benefit from it. And so we need to think in terms of building the connectedness and the support within the school without necessarily over-intervening or intervening too early. Very often what we would focus on is providing psychological first aid, information, care, support, some emotional containment, a sense of continuity, and also a sense of optimism in an individual's ability to manage these experiences. The experience of grief is not just one of loss, it can also be one of gain. And so we can often see within school communities how they've been changed by these experiences of loss, and changed for the better. It might be that people are aware of a sense of connectedness that maybe they didn't appreciate, or even the capacity to survive these experiences. So it's also important that we are watchful for these signs of what we call post-traumatic growth, both at the individual level but also at the school as well. Often this does bring people together closely and intimately. What we often see over time is that connection isn't sustained, and often we can see tension that develops because, in part, people's style of grieving is very different. We'll have some people in the school community say, look, enough is enough, we've dealt with this, let's put it in the past. Whereas there'll be other people in the school community still acutely affected and impacted upon. And so I think a good school leader needs to be attuned to those very different approaches to loss, and finding ways of managing them both effectively. I think many adults have a strong desire to spare children from pain and distress. And I think the experience of death or grief in the context of children is one that challenges adults in a fundamental way. It would be nice if children didn't grieve, if we didn't have to have difficult conversations with children about experiences of loss. But fundamentally, grief is the price we pay for love. And if a child has formed a bond or an attachment, then grief will ensue if that relationship is ruptured. It's important for us to realise that children grieve in a very different way from adults, and for us not to expect that a child will grieve in an adult-like way. A child, for example, won't have access to the same kind of textured emotional language that an adult will. That a child is much more likely to display their grief through their behaviour or through their play than through conversation. That a child is more likely to express their grief through a drawing, perhaps, than through a detailed analysis of their experience. So I think, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that grief is a natural response to loss. That secondly, we don't take a pathological view to grief, that every grieving person needs necessarily intensive intervention. That thirdly, the importance of a supportive, stable adult across time is really critical. That we also acknowledge that children will grieve in a variety of ways. What children will often do is put their grief on hold until the adults or parents around them are okay. And so what we'll often see with children is that they re-grieve over time. A child at 4 might see mum as a star in heaven, but that won't sustain a child at 14. And so a child will continually rediscover and search continually for this sense of new meaning. Certainly it's important that we acknowledge that grief is very much a physical experience as well. It depresses the immune system. You often find in schools that children will report to the sick bay more than usual, or the child who may fall and skin their knee and keep on running may, for example, need the support and care and nurturance of adults. It's important we also give children choices in terms of their level of involvement in terms of these experiences. We might, for example, give children choices in terms of drawing, art, discussion. We may use some of the vast array of children's literature that deals with the experiences of loss and grief. So in a sense, we help children both find language for the experience and also a sense of connectedness. And this is an experience that we all experience, but we also may deal with it in very different ways. We'll often find that grieving children regress both behaviourally and cognitively. That it's difficult for children to process information, to make decisions, that they're more inattentive. That a very young child, for example, who may have been dry at night, for example, may recommence bedwetting. So again, being attentive to those sorts of changes at a physical level are important. But I think what's key is what are the kinds of messages that adults provide. I think often the sins we commit are sins of omission rather than sins of commission, that we really need to be far more proactive in reaching out and providing support. And very often the grieving person will set the limits around that in terms of the nature of the support they want. That the people in the best position to provide support are people who knew the individual prior to this event taking place. These are experiences that create enormous anxiety, enormous distress. And I think it's really important for school leaders to find people outside the school that they can also receive support from. My experience has been that many principals, for example, find it very useful to speak with other principals who've gone through other experiences of loss. That it's an enormous burden to bear. And for many principals, these sorts of events can really be watershed experiences in their career, because it really does amplify the important role of leadership, not just in terms of leadership from a procedural or managerial point of view, but also emotional leadership. To what extent do we give permission for people within a school community? To what extent do we use this experience as a platform, as a springboard for teaching about the nature of life and loss, and that grief is the price we pay for love. And if we have school communities that are based on those principles of love and connectedness, then we also need to develop school communities that respond to the rupturing and the breaking of those emotional connections. Fundamentally, it's about school leaders knowing their staff and being aware of their own particular style of dealing with stress. I'll say that again. Fundamentally, it's about school leaders being aware of their staff, their particular styles, the particular experiences of loss or change that they may be dealing with, or have dealt with in the past. And also acknowledging that people have different safe places, and for some people that safe place may be with others in conversation. For others it may be much more focused on activity or more procedural sorts of approaches. It's also important for school leaders to know what their own particular grieving style is. We often, I think, as a culture, see feelings or emotions as the gold standard, and that people need to express and talk through and communicate their experiences to others. And I think that can be fundamentally challenged because we know that for many people that's not the case. That it's far more important for them to get their head around the experience than their heart. We also need to reconsider the time frame that we traditionally would assume with respect to loss. That these are experiences that don't take days and weeks to deal with, but these are experiences that frequently can take months and years for people to deal with. It's very seductive to have the idea that we reach a point of acceptance, or the grief stops in some way, like grief is the common cold, but we know that in a sense our relationship to that which has lost changes as we change over time. So for many people this will be a continual reworking, that we also acknowledge anniversaries and other experiences, that people know that they actually aren't alone. In the case of a death, that we acknowledge that death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And so actually, how do we keep that relationship alive? And that relationship often will provide people with enormous comfort. A school that has a bedrock of good social support and good sound student welfare and good staff self-care is really in the best position to deal with adverse events. On that foundation of strong relationships, of good conflict management, of good clear communication, these are experiences that can strengthen schools rather than leave them debilitated. The difficulty is in dealing and accommodating the enormous diversity within schools in terms of differences in cultural practices, differences in personalities, difference in terms of what the needs of school communities are. But I think schools can be incredibly proactive too in terms of these experiences. For example, we can rehearse how we may as a school community, how we may as a management team, as a leadership team, deal with a range of experiences. To look at events as they're reported in the newspaper and ask the question, how would we have gone? What would we have done? Who would have taken charge? What would have been our response? That in a sense to take that difficult step of putting ourselves in the shoes of others and asking those questions, then we can develop some sense of control and management. We know when schools are in crisis, one of the protective factors is having a role. Having a role that defines what we're expected to do, and so having in place policies that clarify what those roles are and allow people an opportunity to rehearse those roles can be really important. I think if we talk about grief and loss within school communities, we often focus on these negative life events, the death of a teacher or a student. We also need to think in terms of what are the sorts of messages that we provide students with about the nature of loss and grief and change. To what extent is it reflected in the community? To what extent do we actually use a grief and loss framework for dealing with a range of experiences? And then in a sense these can provide opportunities for us to provide skills to students. These are also teachable moments about the nature of human relationships, and that losses are the shadow of all possessions, whether they're material in terms of people and relationships, or whether they're immaterial, such as things like a sense of order and predictability. That these are experiences that really can shatter the assumptions we have about the way the world works. That bad things don't happen to good people. That children grow up as adults. And that these are experiences can cut across a lot of those assumptions we have that buffer our anxiety and give us that sense of safety and predictability.